Good morning and welcome back to another video. I'm Collin and I do stuff and things on this channel. Today, you already know how long the video is. You already know, and I'm sitting here right now thinking, I can't wait to already have this over with, because who wants to sit in the same spot for 2 hours and say this? So basically I got this idea from Mr. Beast. You all know who Mr. Beast is, but I have a little twist on it. I saw this other guy do it about one of my other YouTubers that I like watching, and he said he was saying his name 10,000 times for him to play a game with him. And he ended up playing a game with him because he said his name 10,000 times. So what if I said Lance Stewart's name 10,000 times so he vlogs with me? You know, you see how that works? Yeah. Basically, I have a counter, and I'm gonna press the button every time. Lance Stewart, 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 and I'm gonna press this every single time. This is gonna suck a lot. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I'm already tired. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. My mouth is dry already. Okay. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. So if you guys have watched me say Lance Stewart 100 times, thank you for watching me. So here's a free high five. Thank you for sticking here for 100 Lance Stewarts. Now stick here for another So every 100 Lance Stewarts, I'm gonna say something. What should I say? I don't know. You'll see when I get to 200 Lance Stewarts. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. His name sounds weird now. Lance Stewart. It just sounds weird now saying it a million times. Oh, hi, Collin. Hi, Collin. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. My mouth is dry. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart 200 times. Woo! Lance Stewart, 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 Lance 210. Lance 210, Lance 210, Lance 210, Lance 210, Lance 210. That's kind of easier to say. Lance 210, Lance 210, Lance 210, Lance 210. Let's do it, 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 let's do it. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Hey Siri, repeat after me. Lance Stewart.
If this is some sort of pledge, my end-user license agreement forbids it.
Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Stewart. I'm saying is Lance Stewart. How do you say his name now? Lance Stewart. Stewart? Lance Stewart. How do you say Lance Stewart? Who is Lance Stewart?
I couldn't find that.
Who is Lance Stewart?
I found this on the web.
Lance Stewart.
I don't see Lance Stewart in your contacts.
Lance Stewart, I guess that's right. Why does it sound so weird? Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I'm lost. I'm found. Lance Stewart, 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 Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lan. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance. See, have I been saying Lan this whole time? Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lan, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Water break, boys. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance 210, Lance 210, Lance 210. Can I just say Lance 210? Lance 210, Lance 210, Lance 210, Lance 210, Lance 210, Lance 210, Lance 210. Well, that is the name of his merch, so I think it counts. Lance 210, 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 Lance 210. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. That's so hard to say. What's up, Lance? Why can't they say Lance, 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 Lance? Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I'm sorry. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. My mouth is dry. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Ooh, Snapchat. Who's it from, Tim? Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Oh, 500 times. If any of you are here at number 500, you get a free hug. Yay! Ah! Sup, my homie? So if you guys are here for 500, I'm not even gonna cut that out. That was awkward. I'm not cutting that out. Cause none of you are even gonna see this. So you guys want a free, you want a free hug? Okay. There you go. If any of you actually did that, thank you. I'm already bored. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. You know what? No one's even gonna see this because you're not even watching anymore, so I'm talking to myself right now. Here's I'm gonna say my biggest secret. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I need like someone pouring water in my mouth while I say this. PewDiePie, 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 PewDiePie. That would have been so much easier. PewDiePie, 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 PewDiePie. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. This sucks. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Hey Lance, if you're watching this right now, can you say my name 10,000 times? Thanks. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. 600 times. Ugh. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Hey Siri, who is Lance Stewart?
The answer is about 8.56 miles.
Who? Okay. Lance Stewart is 8.56 miles, or whatever she said. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart 700 times. Get on me. Who else is playing this game? No one else on YouTube has ever done this video. I'm the first one. For Lance Stewart, of course. My mouth is dry again. I'm gonna go through like 10 water bottles. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance. It's easier to say Lance and not instead of Lance. Lance. It's just a different accent. Sorry, I have different personalities. It's okay. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. You know, 100%. I'm at 800 right now. I know Bruce is watching, and I know Nina's watching, and I know Badass Grandma's watching. I know one of you have to be watching right now. Maybe. You probably are watching this because I tweeted your son and you're gonna check out the video. But I don't think you're gonna make it this far. But if you are, can you comment? I know I'm fangirling. It's okay. I'm a fangirl. It's okay. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Can I tag someone else in? Okay, thank you. Hey, I'm the twin brother now. I'm Collin's twin brother Matthew taking in place. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I want to get to 1,000 before 20 minutes, so let's do this. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. This is like a 10,000 tongue twister. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Wart. He has a wart? Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Weird. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance long story, long story, long story, long story. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart 1,000 times. If you guys are gonna hate on me for saying Lance Stewart, here you go. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. There you go. You can't hate on me now. 1,000 times. If you guys are probably here it 1,000 times because you skipped past it. I'm just saying Lance Stewart 1,000 times took 20 minutes, so do the math. 20 times 10. Hey Siri, what's 20 times 10?
20 times 10 is 200.
And I'm right back, about to say Lance Stewart another 1,000 times. It's successfully loaded. Woo! Lance Stewart. I didn't miss that, did I? Lance Stewart. Let me try something. Am I allowed to do this? Don't hate on me for this either. Am I allowed to do this? I hope I am, because I'm gonna do it. Shh. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I can still talk to you guys. It's not like I'm getting a response from you guys anyway, so. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Let's go watch some Lance videos while I say Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart. Oh wait, I said it there. Woo! Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Was that thunder? I don't know. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart. Use creator code GEL. I'm watching Jelly right now, sorry. Use creator code Jeffrey in the item shop if you guys want to support your favorite creator while playing Fortnite. Lance Stewart. No one saw that anyways. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. No! Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I need water. I have bad breath now. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 This is how we do it. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Gosh, Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I'm gonna be saying Lance Stewart in my sleep. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. You have a foundation of strong values. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Long story. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. I'm kind of cold now, so. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. I probably know Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Ah! Sorry, that was my mommy. She knows I'm saying Lance Stewart 10 million times. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Hi. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. My throat hurts. I guess it's a good way to make me drink water. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Mario, Lance Stewart. Mario, 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 Mario. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. 2,000 times. I did this faster. I'm 5 minutes faster on this one. Yes. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I said an extra time there, don't hate. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. John Salmon, John Salmon, John Salmon, John Salmon. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 2,300 times, and it took me 20 minutes to do 1,300 of them. Woo! Let me reset this now. My camera is already halfway dead, and I've only been doing this for 40 minutes. Good thing I have a charger going with my other battery. Lance Stewart. Here we go. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Ooh, it's raining. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. I can say his name 10,000 times. Mr. Beast. Just wait. Lance Stewart. Okay. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 twice. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I'm getting good at saying his name though. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 go again. Yeah, come on, play. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Right now. Oh my God. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. God, I'm uncomfortable. Let's cross. Yes, I'm in pajamas. Don't judge me. But no one's gonna know because you're not watching this part. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 water. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. That was Big Thunder. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I'm gonna start watching his vids now. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Oh, it's pouring. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. No! Get out of there. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Come on, my mom's messaging me. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. What's up, guys? How you guys doing today? Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. 3,000 times! Whoa! I'm at 3,000! I have another 10 minutes! Woo! I'm getting fast with his name. Woo! Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I bet Lance Stewart didn't expect a fan to do this. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Fire. Cut. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Oh my god, this sucks. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 North Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart! Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance... I don't know, I have a vibrator. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, yeah. Hey Lizzie, has your jaw ever felt tired when you're chewing? My jaw feels tired from saying Lance Stewart. Oh. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Oh, lightning! Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. One water bottle. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Holy crap. Leave a like if you heard that. That was loud. It's a perfect day to do this when it's raining too. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. What's up, guys? How you guys doing today? Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. This is taking a long time. Oh, I hit 20 minutes. I gotta reset it. Oh. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. My battery's about to die! No! Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. So I'm gonna go swap batteries now. I didn't realize this was almost dead, so. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart. Am I even in video? There we go. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. This is tiring. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Let's do 10, 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 let's do 10. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Let's do it, 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 let's do it. Let's do it, 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 let's do it. Let's do it, 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 let's do it. Let's do it, 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 let's do it. Let's do it. Let's do it, 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 let's do it. Let's do it, 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 let's do it. Let's do it, 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 let's do it. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. So tired. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Don't mind me. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 blah. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 yeah. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. 4848. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart! Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. See, before I skip that, because I had to get on the phone with my mom, so Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Now you can't hate on me. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. By the way, I'm at 5,000. I'm halfway done. Let's keep going. Lance Stewart, I'm coming for you. We're gonna vlog together one day. Yep. If I have to do it 100,000 times, I will. That would suck. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Wonder how many calories I'm burning from this. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. My cheeks are getting numb. If you're here watching this, comment down below canon. Whatever. Comment down below canon if you're here right now. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. If you are questioning my accent, it's easier to say his name like that. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, it's easier to go fast with it. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I'm sorry I'm messing up your name, Lance Stewart, but my throat's starting to kill me right now, and I'm cold because it's cold in the here. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance. Oh, I hit 5. Woo! Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Water break. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Stewart, Lance 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 Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. If you guys are still here after 6,000 Lance Stewarts, drop a like. I don't even know. I've been here for over an hour doing this. Lance, my heart's gonna be broken if you don't comment down below at least, or at least subscribe to me. Come on, Lance. But the biggest thing would be for you to vlog with me. That'd be cool. Okay, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. My head's starting to hurt. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. No, it does not, you dumbass. Whoa, I'm sorry. I gotta move. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I gotta move. Oh. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Oh my God. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 let's Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Please don't judge my accent. That's the easiest way to say it for me. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Stewart? Why is his name Lance Stewart? Okay, well I gotta reset this now because it hit 20 minutes. And we're back. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. 6,500. Yee. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Oh, Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 oh. What are those? What are those? What are those? Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. 66666. Woo! Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. 6, 7, 8, 9. Woo! Ugh. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I'm gonna have a heart attack doing this. My heart rate's 95. Oh my God. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance use. Lance Stewart, 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 Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 snort! Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Oh, I gotta move again. Sorry, dudes. Oh. Oh, my camera's getting hot. Oh. Oh. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart 7,000 times. If you guys are here, comment G7X 7,000 times. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. 210, 210. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance210.com. Lance210. What? Lance Stewart. Lance 210. What? Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Oh my god. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I got it. I gotta move. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. This sucks. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 a Lance Stew. Why am I saying a Lance Stew? No one's gonna ever see this though, so. This is Major Roy McBride. I'm attempting to reach Dr. Clifford McBride. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stew. Why do I keep saying a Lance Stew? Hey Siri, a Lance Stew. Okay, just ignore me. You butthole. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 that Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Nice to meet you, Lance Stewart. I'm Collin. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. 7777. Woo! Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I'm sorry, guys. This is getting so tiring. My throat is killing me. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Okay, it's been another 20 minutes. Time's flying. I gotta reset my iPad. Lance Stewart, 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 Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart 8,000 times. Only another 2,000 to go. 2,000 shouldn't take that long, so hopefully by another 19 minutes I can get this done. I'm really hoping so. But I'm thinking another 40 minutes. Which would suck. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. This sucks, man. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance. Lance Stewart, 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 yes, Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Thank you. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Oh, Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lan, what? Lance, what? Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 9,000 times, only one more thousand to go. My camera's about to die, so I gotta swap out the batteries now. Lance Stewart, 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 Stewart, Lance 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 Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Stewart, Lance 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 Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 not a Lance Stew. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 not a Lance Stew, Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I'm getting so close. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. I gotta switch. Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart, Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. My head hurts so bad. No. I'm so glad this isn't 100,000 times. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Lance Stewart, 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 Lance Stewart. Only one more of his name, and it's been 10,000. I'm so happy. So if you guys, I'm gonna need your guys' help with this. I'm gonna need you to tag him on Instagram. I'm gonna need you to comment on his YouTube, tag him on Twitter. I'm gonna need your guys' help because I need him to see this video. Me saying his name 10,000 times. LANCESTEWART. E-W-A-R-T. My throat hurts so bad. So go tag him. I'm gonna need your guys' help. So all together now. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1. Lance Stewart! 10,000 times. So if you guys did enjoy this video, please drop a like and comment down below how far you got into the video. Comment how far you got into the video. Oh my gosh. And also comment down below if you saw any secret messages that I said in the video. Comment that down below too. Oh, if Lance, if you're watching this, oh my god. I don't even know what to say. I got you to follow me on Twitter, so now this is my video, so you will follow me on YouTube. So once again, I'm gonna need your guys' help. Everybody who's watching this, I need Lance to see this. I need Lance to see this. So other than that, I will see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.